The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the streets of Silver Ridge as 10-year-old Daniel Cooper stood at the back of the crowded church, his bare feet dirty against the polished wooden floor, and his tattered clothes drawing disapproving stares from the town's assembled elite. He had come to pay his respects to the only person who had ever shown him kindness in his short, difficult life, even though he knew his presence would scandalize the proper citizens who had gathered to mourn. Jeremiah Blackwood, the wealthiest man in 3 counties, lay in an ornate mahogany casket at the front of the church, surrounded by elaborate flower arrangements that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. The old industrialist had made his fortune in silver mines, cattle ranching and railroad investments, building an empire that stretched from Colorado to California and made him one of the most powerful men in the entire Western territory. Daniel had met Mr. Blackwood 6 months earlier under circumstances that still seemed like a fever dream. The boy had been caught stealing an apple from a produce cart outside Morrison's general store, and the angry merchant had been preparing to summon Sheriff Bradley when Jeremiah Blackwood had intervened. How much for the apple? The old man had asked Morrison, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered promptly. 5 cents. Mr. Blackwood, Morrison had replied, his anger evaporating in the presence of the town's most important citizen. But that's not the point. This little thief needs to learn that stealing has consequences. Blackwood had tossed a silver dollar onto the counter with casual indifference to its value. Then the boy has purchased 20 apples in advance. And Mr. Morrison, if I ever hear of you calling a hungry child a thief again, I'll take my considerable business elsewhere. The incident should have ended there. Just another example of wealthy eccentricity from a man known for his unpredictable generosity. But Blackwood had surprised everyone by taking an interest in the ragged orphan boy, hiring him to do odd jobs around his estate and spending hours talking to him about history, literature, and the complicated business of building wealth in a frontier territory. Daniel, Blackwood had said during one of their conversations, "Never let anyone tell you that circumstances of birth determine a person's worth. I started with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. You have that same fire in your eyes." Now, as Daniel stood in the church listening to Pastor Williams deliver platitudes about Blackwood's charitable works and business acumen, he felt the crushing weight of loss that came from losing the only father figure he had ever known. The other mourners saw a wealthy industrialist being laid to rest. Daniel mourned the man who had taught him to read, encouraged his dreams, and treated him like a human being rather than disposable street trash. The front pews were occupied by Blackwood's relatives, a collection of nephews, nieces, and distant cousins who had shown little interest in the old man during his life, but had arrived promptly for his death. Chief among them was Marcus Blackwood, Jeremiah's nephew and presumed heir, whose expensive suit and calculated expressions of grief fooled no one who had known him for more than 5 minutes. Marcus had visited his uncle's estate exactly 3 times in the past decade, always when he needed money to cover gambling debts or failed business ventures. Jeremiah had given him money each time, but Daniel had overheard conversations suggesting that the old man had little respect for his nephew's character or abilities. Marcus is what happens when privilege replaces effort as the foundation of a man's life, Jeremiah had told Daniel once. He believes the world owes him success because of his name, but he's never learned that true wealth comes from creating value rather than simply inheriting it. As the funeral service concluded and the congregation prepared to move to the cemetery for the burial, Daniel slipped out of the church through a side door, knowing that his presence at the graveside would be considered inappropriate by the town's social gatekeepers. He made his way to a hill overlooking the cemetery where he could watch the proceedings from a respectful distance. The burial was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Jeremiah Blackwood's business dealings, charitable works, or personal kindness. Miners who had worked his claims, ranch hands who had tended his cattle, shopkeepers who had supplied his operations. and countless others whose livelihoods depended in some way on the empire he had built. After the service, the crowd began to disperse, with most people heading to the Grand Hotel, where a reception had been organized for family and important business associates. Daniel remained on his hill, reluctant to leave the place where the man who had changed his life now rested, beneath 6 feet of Colorado soil. "You there, boy?" called out a voice from below. Daniel looked down to see Clarence Webster, Jeremiah Blackwood's attorney, climbing the hill with surprising agility for a man of his years. "Mr. Cooper, isn't it?" "Daniel Cooper?" Daniel nodded warily, unsure why one of the territory's most prominent lawyers would know his name or seek him out at a funeral. Webster was known for his sharp mind and his reputation for handling the legal affairs of the wealthy and powerful with discretion and skill. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to deliver a message to you in the event of his death," Webster said, slightly out of breath from his climb. "He wanted you to know that your friendship meant more to him than you probably realized." The simple statement hit Daniel harder than any elaborate eulogy could have, confirming what he had hoped but never dared to believe, that the connection between them had been genuine, rather than simply the whim of a bored old man seeking to pass his final months with an amusing project. "Thank you for telling me, sir," Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Mr. Blackwood was very kind to me." Webster studied Daniel's face with the careful attention of someone trained to read character in the expressions and bearing of others. "He saw something special in you, son. Something that most people overlook because they're too focused on external circumstances to recognize internal qualities." The lawyer reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope sealed with red wax bearing Jeremiah Blackwood's distinctive J.B. monogram. "Mr. Blackwood also asked me to give you this letter. He wanted you to read it privately before tomorrow's will reading at my office." Daniel accepted the envelope with trembling hands, hardly daring to imagine what message the old man might have left for him. "Will reading, sir?" "Yes," Webster confirmed. "At 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon at my office on Main Street. Mr. Blackwood specifically requested your presence, along with his family members and business associates." The idea that Daniel would be included in such an important gathering seemed impossible, but Webster's serious expression suggested this was not a joke or mistake. "Sir, I don't understand. Why would Mr. Blackwood want me at his will reading?" Webster's smile carried hints of knowledge that he was not yet prepared to share. "That will become clear tomorrow, son. For now, I suggest you read his letter and prepare yourself for some surprises." As the lawyer descended the hill and Daniel was left alone with the sealed envelope, he found himself torn between hope and fear about what the next day might bring. The letter felt heavy in his hands, weighted with significance beyond its physical mass. Daniel carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick paper, recognizing immediately the bold handwriting that had covered countless pages of advice, encouragement, and wisdom during their months together. "My dear boy," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have departed this world and left you to face its challenges without my guidance. Know that my faith in you remains unshaken, and that you possess qualities that will serve you well, regardless of whatever circumstances you encounter. Tomorrow, you will learn things about your future that may shock you and others. Many people will question decisions I have made, and some will actively work to undermine what I have tried to accomplish. Stand firm, Daniel. Remember that true worth comes from character rather than circumstances, and that you have already proven yourself worthy of far more than most people will ever recognize." The law offices of Webster and Associates occupied the second floor of the finest building on Silver Ridge's Main Street, with windows overlooking the bustling commercial district that had grown wealthy on silver mining and cattle trading. At precisely 2 o'clock on the afternoon following Jeremiah Blackwood's funeral, Daniel Cooper climbed the polished wooden stairs with a mixture of excitement and dread, acutely aware that his presence in such refined surroundings would draw hostile attention. The waiting room was already crowded when Daniel arrived, filled with the same relatives and business associates who had occupied the front pews at yesterday's funeral. Marcus Blackwood sat in the most prominent chair, his expensive suit and confident bearing suggesting someone who expected to receive good news. His wife Constance perched beside him, her elaborate dress and jeweled fingers marking her as someone accustomed to wealth and privilege. The other Blackwood relatives formed a constellation of greed and entitlement around Marcus. Their whispered conversations clearly focused on speculation about how Jeremiah's fortune would be divided among them. Nephews discussed which properties they hoped to receive, nieces calculated the value of jewelry and art collections, and distant cousins argued about who deserved larger shares based on tenuous family connections. Daniel's arrival caused the conversations to falter as dozens of eyes turned toward the ragged orphan boy who had somehow secured an invitation to this exclusive gathering. Marcus Blackwood's expression shifted from surprise to contempt as he recognized the child his uncle had inexplicably befriended. "What is this street rat doing here?" Marcus demanded, rising from his chair with obvious indignation. "Webster, surely my uncle didn't intend for common vagrants to attend the reading of his will." Clarence Webster emerged from his private office with the calm authority of someone who had anticipated this confrontation. "Mr. Cooper was specifically invited by your uncle Marcus. He has every right to be present. This is outrageous," Constance Blackwood added, her shrill voice carrying across the waiting room. "We're gathered here to discuss family business, not to entertain street urchins." Several of the other relatives murmured their agreement, creating a hostile atmosphere that would have been intimidating to most 10-year-old boys. But Daniel had survived years on the streets through a combination of courage and determination, and he met their disapproving stares with quiet dignity that seemed to unsettle them more than cowering would have. "If everyone would please follow me into the conference room," Webster announced, "we can begin the reading of Mr. Blackwood's last will and testament." The conference room was dominated by a massive oak table surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most families earned in a month. Oil paintings of stern-faced judges and prominent attorneys decorated the walls, while floor-to-ceiling windows provided views of the mountains that had yielded the silver that built Silver Ridge's prosperity. Marcus Blackwood positioned himself at the head of the table, clearly expecting to assume leadership of the family business empire, while the other relatives arranged themselves according to their perceived importance in the inheritance hierarchy. Daniel was directed to a chair near the foot of the table, as far as possible from the family members who considered his presence an insult to their dignity. Webster opened a large leather folder containing multiple legal documents, each bearing Jeremiah Blackwood's signature and dated just 3 weeks before his death. "Before we begin," the attorney said, "I want to make clear that this will was prepared with full awareness of Mr. Blackwood's mental competency, witnessed by 3 independent parties, and filed properly with territorial authorities. Any challenges to its validity will need to overcome substantial legal obstacles." The disclaimer seemed designed to preempt exactly the kind of legal challenges that Webster expected once the will's contents were revealed, and several of the Blackwood relatives exchanged worried glances at this unusual preamble. "The will begins with several small bequests to various charities and employees," Webster continued, reading through a list of gifts that ranged from $1,000 to $10,000. The amounts were substantial by most standards, but represented only a tiny fraction of Jeremiah Blackwood's estimated $5 million fortune. Marcus Blackwood listened impatiently to these preliminary distributions, clearly eager to reach the portion of the will that would address the disposition of the silver mines, ranch properties, and business investments that constituted the bulk of the estate. "To my nephew, Marcus Blackwood," Webster read, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I leave the sum of $50,000, to be distributed in annual payments of $5,000 over 10 years. This bequest is made in recognition of family ties but also in acknowledgement that Marcus has never demonstrated the character or abilities necessary to manage larger responsibilities. The insult contained within the supposedly generous bequest hit Marcus like a physical blow, his face flushing red with anger and humiliation. $50,000 was more money than most people would see in a lifetime, but it was a pittance compared to the millions Marcus had expected to inherit as Jeremiah's closest male relative. "This is absurd," Marcus exploded, jumping to his feet with fury. "My uncle was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote this will. I demand that it be set aside and a new distribution arranged according to proper inheritance laws." Webster's expression remained calm despite Marcus's outburst. "As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Blackwood's mental competency was thoroughly documented. 3 physicians examined him independently and certified that he was of sound mind when executing this will." The attorney continued reading through a series of bequests to other family members, each receiving amounts that were generous by ordinary standards but fell far short of what they had anticipated. Nieces received $20,000 each, nephews received similar amounts, and distant cousins found themselves beneficiaries of $5,000 gifts that felt insulting given the size of the overall estate. "But that accounts for less than $300,000, protested Eleanor Blackwood, one of Jeremiah's nieces. "What about the mines, the ranches, the railroad investments? Those properties alone are worth millions." Webster paused before responding, clearly preparing to deliver the information that would transform the entire proceeding. "The bulk of Mr. Blackwood's estate, including all mining operations, ranch properties, business investments, and associated assets, has been placed in a trust to be managed for the benefit of a single beneficiary." The room erupted in chaos as every relative began shouting questions about the identity of this mysterious beneficiary. Marcus Blackwood's face had gone from red to purple as he realized that his uncle's fortune was going to someone outside the immediate family, and his wife Constance looked ready to faint from shock and disappointment. "Who is this beneficiary?" Marcus demanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "What stranger has stolen what rightfully belongs to the Blackwood family?" Webster's eyes moved to Daniel Cooper, who sat frozen in his chair at the foot of the table, hardly daring to believe what he suspected was about to be revealed. "The sole beneficiary of the Jeremiah Blackwood Trust," Webster announced, his words falling into sudden silence like stones into a still pond, "is Daniel James Cooper, currently age 10, resident of Silver Ridge, Colorado Territory." For several seconds, no one moved or spoke as the implications of this announcement penetrated the assembled relatives' consciousness. Then the room exploded with protests, accusations, and threats that created such chaos that Webster had to pound his gavel repeatedly to restore order. "This is fraud," Marcus Blackwood screamed, his carefully cultivated veneer of respectability shattering completely. "That street rat has obviously manipulated a senile old man into disinheriting his rightful heirs." "I assure you," Webster replied with steel in his voice, "that Mr. Blackwood was neither senile nor manipulated. He made this decision with full awareness of its implications, and he prepared extensive documentation explaining his reasoning." The attorney withdrew another document from his folder and began reading Jeremiah Blackwood's explanation for his controversial decision. "I have spent considerable time observing my family members and evaluating their character, abilities, and worthiness to inherit the wealth I have accumulated through decades of hard work. What I have discovered disappoints me deeply. My relatives view my fortune as something they are entitled to simply by virtue of blood relationship, without understanding that true wealth must be earned through merit rather than inheritance. They have shown me no genuine affection during my life, visiting only when they needed money and showing no interest in the values and principles that guided my success. In contrast, young Daniel Cooper has demonstrated qualities that I sought unsuccessfully among my blood relatives: integrity, Determination, gratitude, and genuine kindness, untainted by mercenary calculation. In the 6 months I have known him, he has shown me more real companionship and honest affection than my family has provided in decades. The orphan boy has inherited millions. But can he survive the fury of the Blackwood family? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how Daniel fights to claim his incredible inheritance. The weeks following the reading of Jeremiah Blackwood's will transformed Daniel Cooper's life in ways that alternated between wonderful and terrifying. Clarence Webster had arranged for Daniel to be housed temporarily in the Grand Hotel while legal formalities were completed, protecting him from both the hostile Blackwood family and the chaos that his sudden wealth had created. Throughout Silver Ridge, the news that a 10-year-old orphan had inherited one of the territory's largest fortunes spread like wildfire, creating sensational headlines in newspapers from Denver to San Francisco. Public opinion divided sharply between those who admired Jeremiah Blackwood's unconventional decision and those who viewed it as evidence of senility or manipulation. Marcus Blackwood had immediately filed legal challenges to the will, claiming that his uncle had been mentally incompetent and that Daniel had somehow fraudulently influenced the old man's decisions. 3 different attorneys had been hired to build a case that would overturn the inheritance and redistribute the fortune according to traditional family succession. They're going to lose, Webster assured Daniel during one of their daily meetings to discuss the legal situation. Your late benefactor anticipated every argument they might make and prepared overwhelming documentation to support his decisions. But that doesn't mean they won't cause considerable trouble along the way. Daniel sat in Webster's office, still wearing the new clothes that had been purchased for him, but somehow feeling more uncomfortable in fine fabric than he ever had in rags. The transition from street orphan to potential millionaire was disorienting, and he found himself longing for the simple clarity of his previous life when survival was the only concern. "Mr. Webster," Daniel asked, "why did Mr. Blackwood choose me? I don't understand what I did to deserve this." The attorney smiled with genuine warmth as he considered how to answer. "Daniel, Jeremiah saw in you something that his own family lacked, the ability to view wealth as a responsibility rather than an entitlement. He believed that giving you this fortune would create more good in the world than leaving it to relatives who would squander it on luxury and self-indulgence." The legal challenges came to a head 3 months after the will reading, when Marcus Blackwood's attorneys finally managed to schedule a hearing before Territorial Judge Harrison Mitchell. The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the confrontation between the powerful Blackwood family and the orphan boy who had somehow displaced them in Jeremiah's affections. Judge Mitchell was known throughout the territory as a fair but stern jurist who had little patience for frivolous litigation or emotional manipulation. His weathered face and steel-gray eyes had witnessed countless frontier legal battles, and his reputation for cutting through elaborate arguments to reach the heart of disputed matters made him the perfect arbiter for this controversial case. Marcus Blackwood's lead attorney, Reginald Thornton, was a smooth-talking lawyer from Denver whose expensive suit and polished manner marked him as someone accustomed to representing wealthy clients in high-stakes litigation. His opening argument was carefully calculated to appeal to traditional values and social prejudices. "Your Honor," Thornton began, his voice carrying theatrical concern, "this case represents a travesty of justice that demands immediate correction. A vulnerable elderly man was manipulated by a cunning street child into disinheriting his rightful family in favor of someone with no legitimate claim to his affections or his fortune." The attorney spent nearly an hour painting Daniel as a calculating predator who had exploited Jeremiah Blackwood's loneliness and failing mental faculties to secure an inheritance that properly belonged to the Blackwood family. His argument relied heavily on the assumption that no rational person would choose to leave millions of dollars to an often over their own relatives, unless mental impairment or fraud was involved. When Thornton finally concluded his presentation, Judge Mitchell turned his attention to Clarence Webster, who had been listening patiently to the lengthy accusations without visible reaction. "Mr. Webster," the judge said, "I assume you have evidence to counter these serious allegations." Webster stood with the quiet confidence of someone who held unbeatable cards in a high-stakes poker game. "Your Honor, I have overwhelming evidence that not only refutes every claim made by Mr. Thornton, but also demonstrates why Jeremiah Blackwood made the decision he did." The attorney produced a thick folder containing medical evaluations, witness statements, and most importantly, a detailed journal that Jeremiah Blackwood had kept during the final 6 months of his life. The journal documented his observations of both his family members and Daniel Cooper, creating a damning comparison between the greed and selfishness of the former and the genuine character of the latter. "Your Honor, may I read a few excerpts from Mr. Blackwood's journal?" Webster asked. Judge Mitchell nodded his permission, and Webster began reading entries that painted a devastating picture of the Blackwood family's behavior. March 15th. Marcus visited today, as I expected he would after hearing about my latest silver strike. He showed no interest in my health or well-being, but spent 2 hours explaining why he deserved an advance on his eventual inheritance to cover gambling debts in Denver. I gave him the money, knowing it would be wasted, and confirmed my suspicion that he views me as nothing more than a source of funds. April 3rd. In contrast, young Daniel Cooper spent the afternoon helping me catalog my library and asking thoughtful questions about the books we examined. His curiosity about knowledge and his genuine appreciation for learning reminded me of my own youth, before wealth complicated my relationships with nearly everyone I knew. May 20th. My family has learned that I've been spending time with an orphan boy, and several relatives have expressed concern that I'm being manipulated. The irony is exquisite. They worry about a child exploiting me for money, while they themselves have been doing exactly that for decades. The journal entries continued in similar fashion, creating an undeniable record of Jeremiah Blackwood's mental clarity and his deliberate reasoning behind the controversial will. Each entry had been witnessed and notarized by independent parties, making them legally unassailable as evidence of the testator's intent. Webster then called Dr. Samuel Harrison to the stand, one of 3 physicians who had examined Jeremiah Blackwood during the final weeks of his life. "Dr. Harrison," Webster asked, "in your professional opinion, was Jeremiah Blackwood mentally competent when you examined him?" "Absolutely," Harrison replied without hesitation. "Mr. Blackwood's mind was as sharp as any man's I've examined, perhaps sharper. He discussed complex business matters with perfect clarity and demonstrated complete understanding of the legal and financial implications of his decisions." "Did he ever mention his nephew Marcus or the rest of his family?" Harrison's expression showed disapproval as he recalled those conversations. He expressed disappointment that his relatives had shown so little genuine affection during his life. "He told me that the only person who had treated him like a human being rather than a source of money was a young orphan boy who asked for nothing but companionship." The testimony continued for several hours, with witness after witness confirming Jeremiah Blackwood's mental competency and explaining the reasoning behind his unconventional will. The cumulative effect was overwhelming, gradually transforming public opinion from skepticism to support for the old industrialist's decision. Finally, Judge Mitchell called Daniel himself to the stand, wanting to hear directly from the boy who had somehow inspired such devotion from one of the territory's wealthiest men. "Son," the judge said gently, "I want you to tell me in your own words about your relationship with Mr. Blackwood. How did you meet him?" Daniel took a deep breath and told the story of their first encounter, describing how the old man had paid for the stolen apple and then invited him to do odd jobs at his estate. As he talked, Daniel's genuine grief over Blackwood's death became evident, along with his confusion about why he had been chosen to inherit such wealth. "Mr. Blackwood taught me to read," Daniel explained, his young voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He said that education was the key to improving my life, and he spent hours every day helping me with books and arithmetic. He never made me feel stupid or worthless like most people did." "Did you ever ask Mr. Blackwood for money or gifts?" Judge Mitchell asked. "No, sir," Daniel replied honestly. "I didn't know he was wealthy until after he died. I just thought he was a kind old man who liked having someone to talk to." The judge studied Daniel's face carefully, his experienced eye apparently seeing the same qualities that had impressed Jeremiah Blackwood. "And what will you do with this inheritance if the will is upheld?" Daniel had thought about this question extensively during the month since learning about his windfall. "Mr. Blackwood told me that wealth was a responsibility, sir. He said that people who have been fortunate have an obligation to help others. I want to use the money to help orphans like me, so they don't have to steal apples or sleep in alleys." The simple honesty of Daniel's answer seemed to resonate throughout the courtroom, creating a shift in atmosphere that even Marcus Blackwood's attorneys could sense. This was not a manipulative street child seeking to exploit an old man's loneliness. This was exactly the kind of person Jeremiah Blackwood had believed deserved his fortune. Judge Mitchell's ruling, delivered after 2 days of deliberation, validated Jeremiah Blackwood's will in its entirety and dismissed all challenges raised by the Blackwood family. His written opinion contained language that would be quoted for generations in discussions of inheritance law and testamentary freedom. A person's right to dispose of their property as they see fit is fundamental to our legal system. Jeremiah Blackwood exercised that right with full mental competency and clear moral purpose. That his decision offends traditional expectations about family inheritance does not make it legally invalid. Indeed, his choice to reward character over blood relationship represents the highest ideals of American meritocracy. As Daniel left the courthouse with Clarence Webster, he found himself surrounded by well-wishers who had been moved by his story and impressed by his dignity throughout the legal proceedings. The orphan boy in rags had become a symbol of hope for everyone who believed that character mattered more than circumstances of birth. "What happens now?" Daniel asked Webster as they pushed through the crowd. "Now," the attorney replied with satisfaction, "we begin the real work of managing your inheritance and fulfilling Jeremiah Blackwood's vision for what his fortune could accomplish. In the hands of someone who understands its true value, Daniel Cooper's journey, from street orphan to millionaire, would be remembered throughout the territory as proof that America's promise of opportunity extended even to society's most vulnerable members. The inheritance that seemed impossible had become reality, and with it came the responsibility to prove worthy of the faith that Jeremiah Blackwood had placed in an orphan boy who asked for nothing but kindness. What an incredible journey from rags to riches. Daniel proved that true worth comes from character, not circumstances. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of triumph and justice in the Old West. Share this inspiring story with everyone who believes in the power of kindness and the rewards of genuine character. What was your favorite moment in Daniel's transformation from orphan to heir?